Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thanks for being with us for this session focused on renewable energy, which is a really key topic today because it opens up a lot of electric debates within the government. If you haven't been following, just to remind you the facts, yesterday in a column published in the Figaro, the Minister of the Interior and President of the Republican Party asked that we stop funding renewable energies because he says it's just expensive and it's difficult to manage, and according to him, this opens up to a risk of blackout in France. In an interview with Le Monde, the Minister of the Ecological Transition said that Bruno Retailleau was having a populist approach, was trying to fracture the country and opening up the country to the dangers of climate change. And she talked about the fact this would impact our relationship with gas and oil providers. Emmanuel Macron said that we need new renewable energies and that we need to make sure that regulations affirm and support the transition. Sorry, you can't hear me properly? But I do have the microphone right by my mouth, as is recommended. So, renewable energies, a strategic priority, that's the theme of this session. So to talk about this, I am delighted to welcome Estelle BRACHLIANOFF, who's the CEO of Veolia. I've got Sylvie JÉHANNO with us, Jean-Philippe PUIG, Thierry, who is founder and chief executive officer of Meridiam, and Anne-Christine Champion, who is co-head of global banking and investor solutions for Société, Générale. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being with us. And so before starting, I'm going to hand over to Claire WAYSAND, who is a member of the Cercle of the Economists and Deputy Director of the NG Group, just to introduce the subject. Thank you very much, Fabrice. It's great to be with you, to see so many of you this morning on this subject, which might seem to be a bit provocative when we ask this question about whether renewable energies is a strategic priority. Given the debates that are going on in France, the columns that are being written, some people might be saying it might be a bit of a provocative to have a session on this theme. But do you know that in Europe today, around 40 and 50% of electricity is produced from renewable energies? Do you know that in China, it's 30% of electricity production from renewable energy, and every year China is installing as much renewable energy capacity as all other countries put together. China, of course, is focused on its economy and its competitivity. So why is there this progress in terms of renewable energy? Well, there's a whole number of reasons, but actually it's fairly easy to understand. The first reason is that we are, of course, in an emergency situation where we need to respond to climate change. Each of you can see year on year in X and elsewhere, climate change is progressing with extreme temperatures, with these catastrophes, these climate catastrophes. That's the first reason, but it's not the only reason. And in France, sometimes we tend to look in the rearview mirror rather than looking towards the future. When we look towards the future, and this is the second reason why we should be focusing on renewable energies that are dynamic, what we can see is that electricity demand is going to grow. Why? Because the energy transition involves the electrification of a number of different uses, and we have sectors that are going to have a lot of electricity demand. I'm thinking in particular of digital technologies, AI technologies, data centers. I'm thinking about electrical mobility, which are going to be sources of growing demand as well. So renewable energies are the fastest way of installing electric capacity. Sometimes people put in place an opposition between nuclear and renewable energies, whereas a nuclear power station takes 15 years to put in place. But if you put in place a field of wind power turbines, that it takes 2 years once all the authorization permits have been granted. So the first reason is that renewable energies is a good way to respond to the growing demand. The second good reason is that renewable energies are competitive. The cost of renewables has dropped. The cost of solar power has been cut by 10. And we can see assessments from the International Energy Agency which are assessing the corrected cost of value for the system. So yes, of course, taking into account the fact that there is intermittence, there is flexibility, that we need to find ways of managing this intermittent supply and this flexibility. But the IEA evaluates this at between 65 and 75 megawatt hours, and these figures of course depend a lot on the funding. So we have to manage the flexibility, so we need batteries, we need pumped step power, and also flexibility at demand side are also going to be crucial. That's going to be part of the energy transition along with the renewable energies. The penultimate point is that electrical energies are complementary, and the fact that we have a diverse provision is a good way of protecting ourselves against risk. I'd also want to add that once renewable capacity has been installed, it doesn't rely on external supply, so countries that are exporting fossil energy. But renewable energies, once installed, it provides energy for 20-25 years, and therefore is a way of ensuring sovereignty, energy sovereignty. The final point around the energy transition is not just about electricity. Electricity will be 50 to 60% of uses by 2050. The rest of it will be heat and cold power, and we're also going to be using molecules, and we're going to be talking about that. I also want to mention an IFOP survey, and since I've run out of time, I'll just give you one figure. Fabrice was saying that sometimes there's a lot of debate between the different political sides, but let's have in mind that today when we ask French people their image of renewable energy, 84% of French people have a good image of renewable energies, and this is a figure which is really across all parties. Thank you, Fabrice.
Thank you, Claire, for these words of introduction. Let's start the first roundtable discussion. Estelle BRACHLIANOFF, when we hear the controversies, do you think that the title of this roundtable would could have done with a question mark, renewable energies? Is it really a priority? Well, you know, I remain very skeptical when I hear these discussions. Quite, you know, I'm amazed actually. What have we rediscovered in the last 3-4 years? Energy transition is a geostrategic weapon. We're talking about competitiveness, transition, CO2, but also independence, strategic autonomy of countries. Do we want to depend on the importation of fossil fuels in France and Europe? The answer is no, of course. So why should we oppose the renewable energies? Like, it's good for the planet, but there are more serious matters in life. Would be like, you know, the geostrategic challenges or stakes. Well, I mean, the two combine naturally. So let's not be diverted by political debates, which are one side it's never enough, and the other side by, you know, any constraints or standard would be by per se a bad thing. And as Claire said, and I like the statistic at the end, most of the population understood what we're talking about. Let me add that this is an aspect of competitiveness, to have access to cheap energy, because affordable energy, because this fair transition is essential, and renewable energies are fully in that. So let me conclude by saying that in RE we talk about wind farms, sun power farm, but there is also something we don't talk about, which are energies produced locally from what we call the recycled energy. Let's call it recycled energy. The so-called heat that is useless, that can be reused in industrial process, you know, for non-unrecyclable waste from small wastewater treatment plant and so on and so forth. And often I'm being told, okay, but is it at the scale in the energy mix? Yes, of course. Everything I've said at the European scale is a deposit. Just like we have oil deposits, we do have local deposits who could actually supply 50 million of Europeans, you know. So we can see that this is 10–15% of energy mix, depending on the countries. Local energies, which has been recycled, that can be explored even more and faster than we did today. And once more, it's an aspect of geostrategy and competitiveness and purchasing power. Thank you very much. We'll discuss that again in the second part of the unknown energies. One question though, if we talk about sovereignty, does it work with the elected officials or the local? Well, I think there are different arguments in what I said. The notion of sovereignty is national. But at the national level, it's a word that is indeed a word that everybody agrees. The independence of the country, yes. When you talk at the local level as well, you know, strangely enough, you said, oh, I'd like my city to be self-sufficient in energy. Okay, those are discussions we having with several elected officials. So the local officials, yes, the answer is yes.
Sylvie, JÉHANNO.
Sylvie, JÉHANNO. So let's stay focused on this theme, which raised a number of different questions. Without going into a semantic analysis of the subject, we could say that renewable energies are a priority. So priority, that means something. That means it needs to happen first. So according to you, do you think renewable energies needs to come before other things such as nuclear power? First of all, good morning, everybody. Well, I think this question is being asked to me because I lead a subsidiary of EDF. But first of all, I just wanted to say that yesterday I talked with a lot of people, and I was asked, why is there a question mark around this question of priority? So why are we doing this? But what we can see is that on the European market, we've got negative prices for electricity. At the moment, there's actually quite a lot of electricity available, and so that's fairly good, because 2 or 3 years ago, we were talking about the need to watch our energy use because we thought we were going to be short of energy. So the first thing I want to say is that we need to think in the long term. And first of all, priority. What is a priority? We are celebrating an anniversary. In 2015, there were the Paris Accords. We talked about 2 degrees as a maximum at that point, and now we're at 1.57. So the priority is fighting against climate change. How are we going to do that? Well, we do that by eliminating CO2. We need to remove CO2 emissions. We need to divide these by 6, as opposed to from 1990 levels. And so, of course, as Claire said, we're going to need to electrify more and more vehicles, heat pumps, hydrogen. We were talking about hydrogen a lot recently, but hydrogen is a little bit behind the curve in different scenarios, so that could explain these different scenarios. So this climate emergency of reducing CO2 means that we really need to stop opposing different types of energy, stop opposing nuclear power and renewable power. So the point is that we need to think about low carbon. That means we need to have no gas, we need to get rid of gas and fuel oil wherever we can in order to have electricity solutions or other renewable energies or energy recovery systems. Of course, we don't talk a lot about heat. That's something that was mentioned. If you look at the country's consumption, 45% of France's energy consumption is focused on producing heat. When I say heat, I'm talking, of course, of heating, hot water, and industrial heat. And of course, there's a whole number of different ways to reduce the carbon around heat. We can recover electricity, we can recover heat energy, we can convert into electricity. So we've talked about these different types of technology. We've talked about wind power, etc. But there's a whole number of new technologies that are coming, hydrogen and others, a whole number of different technologies and innovations that are there. And so the goal is to get rid of CO2. Just before I hand over to Mr. Puig, I've got a question. You said that we're not so concerned now about electricity shortages, and the question is to what extent are exports going to be able to absorb the surplus, and also in terms of data centers and automobile industry, should we slow down the development of renewable energies? Electrification is well underway. I think it's a good thing if we're exporting energy. That's just a really good thing for energy sovereignty, and it's good for the economy. Of course, in terms of for data centers, France is a country that's really very attractive, so there will be consumption. And so every day I can see surface geothermal projects. So what it's about, just going 100, 200 meters down to get heat, and this develops heat pumps, and this involves electricity. So electrification is well underway. Perhaps at the moment in some scenarios we're a little bit ahead in terms of provision, but I really don't think we need to balance things out. We just need to encourage the removal of CO2 using all the different energies available. Thank you very much.
Quel regard portez-vous sur ce débat aujourd'hui?
So, Jean-Philippe Puig, what is your position about renewable energies? Is it only nuclear or renewables as well? Well, let me react to what Sylvie just said. Well, let's oppose the solutions. I mean, you know, to oppose different forms of energy supply. Well, we are in the agro-food industry, you know, often they oppose energy and food. Well, in the Avril group, in the 70s, you know, at the end of the 70s, we became aware of the fact that there was a problem of sovereignty. You might not know, but at the time, we carried 90% of, we imported 90% of proteins to feed the cattle and animals, you know, animal food. And they decided to do more protein crop. You see now the fields of colza in April, you know, I mean, to produce proteins for animals. So we down to less than 40% of imports versus 80% in the past. You know. So having said that, you got oil and you got a separate you got a byproduct called the oil. And the oil, well, we have to find an outlet. And it's energy, and there is no opposition. You know, we do it for the food industry, not for the oil, but for the protein, and therefore we developed renewable energies, liquid renewable energies, and this is essential because it reduces the imports of soja, and often you know, it improves the income of the French farmers, and I think we should be proud of that. We need all forms of energies, as I said, and but today it's the equivalent of 3.5 million tons of oil that are not being imported because they're produced from vegetal waste in France. So if I translate that into sun power panels, it's twice as many existing sun power panels. So that is 55,000 soccer fields. So you see, so if we stop we would have this would have a huge impact if we were to stop. So let's stop opposing resources, and the French need energy, and they're happy with the new solution. So okay, so we have discussions, position of RNA and the drop of electricity, you know, this will damage the business model of some projects. Are there still investors for ENRs?
Bien évidemment.
Of course, the answer is yes. Investors look, nevertheless, at the long term and visibility. That's really the key question. So in this debate, there's a lack of visibility, and I'd rather work with the figures of the RTE and Le Creux in order to see how we get abundant, carbon-free, cost-effective energy for France. And so for me, the question isn't about renewable energies, nuclear energy, or others. So that's a question that comes afterwards. The priority is having the right kind of energy, and what we have to work with is forecasts and with an idea of technical capacity. Unfortunately, a lot of our politicians don't really have a mastery of these questions. Perhaps that's the role of the Creux organization, because I can see Emmanuel in front of us, and that's part of his role with the Parliament. But in terms of financiers, what associates what encourages finance is the possibility to have visibility. That involves costs, of course. That includes regulations, the capacity to be able to justify long-term investment, and it also involves a lack of volatility at a political level around the debate. And so this whole debate really doesn't help, particularly when there's not a lot of content to it. It just creates volatility in people's thinking, and of course it just discourages investment. Since we are long-term investors, all things change. Nobody is elected forever in France, and when you have a 20-year perspective, a lot of things can happen. But we really need to stay focused on the truth of figures and analyses and the technological capacities to find solutions in order to get this abundant, available, carbon-free, cost-effective energy. So in terms of subsidies around renewable energies, does that discourage investors, the level of these subsidies? Well, first of all, not all renewable energies need to be subsidized. So we could talk about this in the context of a multi-annual budget debate, and it's worthwhile talking about. There are agencies like the ADEME who do studies about how we can get the best investment for the best technology, and this is a technical debate, and there are solutions for making these decisions. So we really need to mix everything up and throw the baby out with the bathwater. When you're talking about visibility in 2 years' time, of course, we've got the presidential election, so of course we don't necessarily know what France's energy policy will be depending on the person that's elected. Does that impact this visibility? What's more concerning is that you think that the French presidential election should influence the energy policy of France, when actually, as we've heard, the priority is combating climate change, is energy sovereignty, it's abundant and cost-effective energy for industry. And so if there are politicians today in France who don't agree, then we should be afraid. Indeed. Thank you very much.
Financial analyst specialized in defense industry was telling me that since the end of March, he received calls from all parts of the world. Do you see the same need of investors for R&E, or do you see a change and a sort of change in the way portfolios are being structured? Now, what we do observe is a high appetite for R&Es. The funding of energy, which is the first economic sector in France, in Europe, and in the world, is always found financing capabilities. You know, in terms of amounts, you know, in RNEs, we've seen that in the 20, 30 years. You know, there were always financing capabilities and also capabilities in terms of development of new technologies. We've seen that, and decarbonation are also new technologies. Offshore wind farms was able to find fundings with the floating wind farms, you know, offshore wind farms. There could be also interconnections that will enable networks to improve its capabilities to finance interconnections. In the business plan, there should also be mentioned the negative hours. All this, of course, the financial players know how to structure it, present it to the market with banks and now financial institutions, non-banking financial institutions, including savings, long-term savings, and those long-term assets, that is the renewable energy, will always find, you know, people, you know, for long investment in pension. When we see projects like the project of floating wind farms off the island of Oléron, everybody goes away because the project is no longer profitable. People still invest. Well, this is part of, well, you know, our job as a bank institution is to take risk and to find the proper assignment of risk between the stakeholders of the project. This will be different funding parts. The project we're talking about operate with a higher technological risk, rather, you know, compared to the onshore wind farms. But I'd like to add that in the decarbonization trend, there is something about competitiveness which is essential. And in fact, more than rather than opposing technologies, we want to make sure that we still have the capability to have cheap or affordable energy. And I was in China Energy Engineering in China announced a call for tender on the battery storage, electrical battery storage, with a drop in price of 30% versus last year. So when we talk about intermittent supply with renewable energy, the challenge is about to be taken with technical solutions or usage solutions, which be interconnections forecast. And thank you, Christine.
So we're going to move on to the second phase of this debate. You mentioned this, Claire, in the debate, in the introduction to the debate. There's not just wind power and solar power. There's a whole number of different types of energy, which are perhaps quite marginal still. But what would the conditions be to develop these further? So perhaps if I come back to what's been said in this whole mix of solutions, it's not necessarily the case that we always need subsidies. In fact, that's far from the case. In terms of Chinese innovations, what we're seeing is that innovation is making it possible to reduce costs, because this question of the affordability of the energy mix is something that's really essential for industry and also for the population. Sorry, but do you think in terms of depending on Chinese technology for in terms of sovereignty, well, that's a problem? I think we all agree in our institutions that we need to develop French and European technologies. So the examples I'm going to give you, there's no Chinese technology in these examples I'm going to give you. So it's hot, so I'm going to talk about some cooling examples rather than some heating examples. So we've got a world innovation in Barcelona when we're recovering cold from the LNG terminal, because of course when liquid gas goes across the Atlantic, in order to become, I guess, we create cold or that it isn't used for anything, and it's being used in the Barcelona market, which is the provisions market for Barcelona, and so we're using recycled cooling for this. We've talked as well about data centers. If we track all data centers. They need electricity. It also needs water in order to be cooled. In Cercle, just outside Paris, we've used this unused heat, which is being used to cool off a data center, and it's been fed into a urban heating network. In another area, not far from there, there is heat that's being used from industry. Here we don't need Chinese technology. There's no subsidies. This is green. This is renewable. It uses local sources and responds to sovereignty questions. Thank you very much, Estelle BRACHLIANOFF. Sylvie, JÉHANNO, you're also somewhat specialized in these unknown energies, particularly heat in particular. What do you think, which of these have the most potential? Perhaps you could give two of them to us. Well, there are lots of these types of energy, and I want to tell you a story just to show you that this is not a small issue. In Lille, the urban heating network, the chair of the metropolitan area was wanting to really develop things up to 2050, and so there was a call for tenders that took about a year, and we are proud to have been selected to multiply by 3 the urban heat network. That means we like thinking about housing unit equivalents, but of course we're going to be thinking about tertiary buildings, swimming pools. So we're going to get 75,000 additional, we're going to connect 75,000 additional housing units connecting into this heating and hot water, which is 95% carbon free. And it comes from, because 60% of the energy comes from recovery, like has just been described. So heat from wastewater, from industry, and also from the waste incinerator. The rest is going to come from a biomass boiler. A biomass, of course, there's lots of different types of biomass. We'll get ultra-local wood source. We're going to get wood residue. We're going to take residue from the forestry industry at less than 25 kilometers distance, and then wood pallets, as long as they haven't been varnished or painted, we can use them, and the rest of that will be gas. 5% gas, that means virtually all the time we're at 100% renewable energies most of the time. It's just when it's very cold that we'll be using gas. And so what did the president of the metropolitan area want? Well, yes, he wanted sovereignty. He wanted a competitive price. That means that we have to encourage people to decide to take this, the people who are going to be connected. So we're aligned with just below the gas price. So that in order to do that, we do need subsidies, and this is supported by the heating fund in order to support this type of project. And so we're going to be under the gas price, and then we will be stable and competitive. We're completely uncorrelated from fossil energies. And then we're also going to remove energy vulnerability from a whole number of different housing units. We're recruiting locally to do this. I want to say something that's really very important. We're going to be running this network digitally. There are connectors everywhere. There is AI involved everywhere to drive this network. That means we're going to be coordinating these different types of energy. There's energy recovery, there's wood, there's heat pumps, there's also the generation of cooling, and all of that needs to be managed with digital models, complex digital models. And what we want to do is what we love saying with Dalkia is that we want to consume better and consume less. We want to have a carbon-free approach, and we want to use a low-carbon and cheapest energy as possible. And also we want to consume as little as possible, because when we don't consume, we don't emit any CO2. So this is really a remarkable system which is going to show that flexibility. I want to come back to your question earlier about exports. Organizing flexibility of storage You think about those hot water tanks at home. It's a form of flexibility. And we are going to do that across the whole network. Of course, we can do that with electricity and batteries. This also links into when we have surpluses. I haven't talked about geothermal power, but that's also really very interesting. There's so much potential in that area, and there's so much to do there.
Vraiment un mot que représente.
Just one word. What about subsidies in a heat project like this? What, 30–40%? Yeah, can go up to such. Yeah, depending on the complexity of the situation, the size, of course, of the project. It could be less. To recover heat from a waste incinerator in a district today, well, it could be done. So it depends. Again, it depends clearly on the nature of the situation, and it's tailor-made, and ADEME knows how to do that. Okay, 800 million in 2025. Thank you, Sylvie, JÉHANNO. Mr. PUIG. So there are domains, industries where we cannot use electricity. We're talking about the railways in non-electrified line, aircrafts, industry or road traffic for trucks. So what can be the role of such liquid energies in the energy mix? Marginal. Well, there are regulations and laws that have been voted. So there is an obligation, European obligation, to have 70% of renewable in 2050. Is it possible? Good question. Well, today we produce roughly 1 billion litres of green kerosene. So we have to multiply this by 400. We wouldn't have to multiply it by 400. We have to produce 400 times more between now and 2050. Now, if the origin is biomass or oil, we're going to be in competition now, because Sylvie said biomass is being used on many applications and more. So we will have to manage the scarcity at the European level. It's an opportunity as well. We want to make sure that we produce more biomass and oil. This is what we, in crops, there are rotation, rotating crops, we don't, it so happens over every second year, well, there are 3 months where 3 months ago we have a vegetable cover, but in the 3 months we don't necessarily have any oil producing crops. So we don't want to use use what's used for food or animal food, but use 3 months which are not used for food industry. Regulation exists to push, oleaginous crops. They call intermediary crops, and then we need to develop seeds, products, transformation plants. So we are talking about a long process which calls for heavy investment, and but it won't solve all the problems, and we'll have to keep the liquid renewable products for utilities which cannot generate electricity. For example, use electricity. If you take the regional line of the trains, they are diesel-powered trains, so we'll have to use these energies, only in places where electrical power supply is not impossible. It's very costly. So the solution now, immediately, is to do this with, and for the air industry, what maximum can be reached if we cannot reach the 70%, as Brussels says. For the upstream from I don't have the percentage upstream, oil or biomass, we will not cover 400 times what we produce today. So other technologies will come. Simply, I'll let you imagine, a hydrogen power planes. It's not, we have a friend from Safran, it's not soon. So we'll have to push technologies or review the obligations or requirements, because I don't know how politicians establish the rule of law, but it doesn't look today, I don't want to be pessimistic, but very unlikely that we'll reach 70% in 2050. What about waste oils? Can we go further in this domain? Well, waste oil, we all talk about waste oil. We take all the waste oil and we do fuel for the air industry. Well, first, we recycle a great part thereof, so we didn't wait for the regulations to do that. We can do better. definitely. And there is a law, European law, which has been voted to foster, oils in the economic level, but opens the door to importation of waste oil. So on the paper, it was not silly as such, but the Chinese could, or people from Singapore or Malaysia, so this is an opportunity by saying, well, it's not very well. I'll take a 30,000 ton tank, put except they put fries in it, but it's a disaster. It doesn't work because you have to note that 20% of biofuel is made from waste oil, false waste. It's a waste bashing, actually. It's a waste greening washing, whatever, which comes from China, and 20% of the product are European fuels. If we keep going like this, we're going to shut down our plants. So it's a bit scary. So in the Air France planes, there are, fake biofuel. I didn't say Air France, 20% of the European market. So this is what you have in pumps everywhere.
On a parlé tension budgétaire.
Thank you very much. So we've talked about tensions around budgets. Are there innovative finance mechanisms that would help us to reduce subsidies? Well, like Anne-Christine was saying, financing depends on the risk and yield combination. When subsidies are no longer there, we need to think perhaps more longer term, because it helps things to be better understood and managed. But in terms of a political approach, it's important. It's hard to imagine that with a political approach we're going to be able to take more risks for lower yields. At least I wouldn't advise that. With philanthropy and with this objective of aiming for carbon-free energy and combating climate change, in this concept of adaptation, which applies to energy, it's possible to find funding with a lower capital cost that we mix together with subsidies or with more expensive capital. But the truth is, I think the debate today is not really about subsidies or no subsidies. I think, but at the political level, the debate is presented in that way. Yes, okay, it is a debate for people who are thinking about subsidies every day, but I think for the future of energy and French energy sovereignty, of course subsidies have a role to play, but sometimes regulations have more impact than subsidies. The capacity of the European market, which is still designed in a rather complex way, and sometimes that has more of an impact than the amount of subsidies in terms of the capacity of investment of investors. So let's think about a European market that isn't so fragmented, that isn't so vulnerable, that could be more resilient, and that will make it possible for us to mobilize more investment. We need to avoid thinking that subsidies is the key, especially when they get withdrawn halfway through a contract, as France and Spain have both tried to do. Subsidies are not necessarily entirely reliable, so let's think long-term. Let's think about regulations, about how to create a European market for energy which encourages investment, rather than thinking about whether the subsidies are going to make it possible for me to earn a bit more or a bit less. Thank you very much, Mr. DÉAU. Mrs. Champion, on this same question, what about innovative funding?
Well, concerning innovative funding, financing, we do see some solutions. Well, a point on subsidies. Our economies for the last 50 years functioned as if CO2 was some kind of an infinite capability as a resource. We're just realizing that it's not the case. Infinite resource at zero price, and therefore the way we support this transition is when we give a price to carbon. So in some domains like steel industry, the European regulation says that there are They will be priced as a function of the carbon rate in steel production. And therefore, this led to projects such as the Stegra project, Avril in Sweden, 6 billion euros, which to have such project in the north with technological innovation, financial innovation to finance this green steel with long purchase contract from the automotive industry. So financial engineering exists to support decarbonation. Thank you. Pierre Vizan, you want to take the floor, Claire? So thank you, Fabrice. Yes, one word. And now no longer Cercle des économistes. So this is as NG speaker. One word. We talk about subsidies. We've been talking about subsidies, but there are projects which are viable subsidies-free projects for renewable and the rest. What's important is the scaling up. You know, we have in the group sun power, the renewable energy in the southwest of France, which is a reliable project. No subsidies. It's a long land close to the connection to the grid, and it can be done tomorrow with sun power made in France because it's highly competitive. This project will function with bilateral agreements with buyers, people who will buy the PPA. You know, this will give visibility to the investor who will invest in the project, and industrialists who know the price he will pay for electricity for a long period of time. So I just wanted to add that this project today is being slowed down for regulatory reasons. So when we invest, we can do it in a certain number of cases without any subsidies on a project up to scale. All you need to have is remove the regulation barriers. Claire, then we give the floor. We have Emmanuel Bargon with us. So. Manager of Avril, so a French agency for renewable energies. Can you give us your views on this discussion? Hello? First, 2 points. First, when we look at the production the last few days, France used the anti-production of the nuclear power plant and the RNA available. The sun power was fully running. We got decarbonated production and a slight surplus, we sold it. So RNAs we're talking about their function even in sun power. Well, clearly we do have a lot of sun, and they supply the French market. And in 2025, like in 2024, we do have we achieving records in decarbonated electricity. We have the lowest price of electricity in Europe for about a year, except for the north of Scandinavia, which has a lot of hydroelectricity. Prices are 20 euros of the megawatt cheaper than Germany. Prices are cheaper than Italy or the UK. So this renewable energy contributes to low prices, and to contribute to the discussion, it'd be good. We should not turn into. We should stop turning solutions into problems.
Est-ce qu'il y a des...
Are there any questions in the room? I think there's 2 questions here. Microphones are just coming. Please do introduce yourself, sir. Hi, I am Thomas Gellet. I'm a nuclear engineer. I totally agree with what's been said, but you're forgetting one thing. Renewable energy does not make it possible to increase voltage or even frequency. See what happened in Spain and Portugal, where there was a blackout. Germany, where there's quite a lot of renewables. Germany has all of its nuclear power plants that it is opening up. We've got a voltage problem here. Would you like to respond? Well, this is a question for the grid managers. But yes, it's true, it's more complicated to get a mix operating with renewable energies, but there are solutions around voltage. And in terms of the Spanish blackout, we cannot necessarily say that the cause is to do with renewable energies. It's more to do with the interface within the network and all the different production methods. But network managers know how to do this, and we need to continue talking to the grid managers about this. They can do it. Good morning, I'm Mrs. Barthet. Thanks to Veolia in Africa, I had the opportunity to work with solar panels and work in health centers. And so my question today is, if we as ordinary people, what can we do as ordinary people to raise awareness of mayors and local authorities so that we have greater power, so that together in groups of houses we can work on these questions through all the work that you're explaining to us? The biggest challenge that I have at my level is this. That's really an excellent question. It's really this question of education, because we're working with technical questions here, and so this kind of exercise is part of educating people. So of course, when we inaugurate projects, we need to communicate, and it's even more important to communicate because we're going to need skills, and we need to tell young people that these professions are professions for the future. We need to encourage them to commit to the energy transition, which sometimes seems a bit complicated. Electrical engineering, cooling engineering, and all of this. And when we know that these professions help us to carry out our projects, and we're going to know these. I recruit 2,000 people every year, and sometimes I have some challenges to find apprentices and technicians. So let's talk about these projects, and let's help young people to have the desire to work in these technical professions. That's something that's really important for future generations. Estelle BRACHLIANOFF. Yes, I think I'm really very optimistic, and that's what the survey that Claire cited earlier. The general population has understood these questions, and the question they're asking is, how can I act? And that's how I understand your question. It seems that you are very aware of the question, and that the question is, how can I act? What can I do? And I think this is a collective question. If I connect into what we've just heard from Manuel Varron, the question is, how I know what we need to do, but how can we go quicker? How can we go faster? And this question of getting permits that take years, even though there's no subsidies, and having a collective project for the country is an essential issue. Of course, renewable energies are associated with competitivity, with energy sovereignty, and it's of course important for this climate change situation. If collectively we're saying that's the goal, and we want to focus that, and rather than thinking in terms of years, we think in terms of weeks, in terms of thinking in terms of change it, instead of thinking in terms of months, we think in terms of weeks, and that will help us move forward. Perhaps for the conclusion we could hand over to Claire Vaison. Thank you, Fabrice. Well, my conclusion is very straightforward, because there's a lot of agreement here on this panel. I think that we really all understand that we need to succeed in this energy transition, and in terms of what you've just said here in the audience, we need to do this with people. That means the transition needs to be affordable, because behind the concept, the competitivity of our businesses and the ability to compete on world markets, there's also this links into the question of buying power. And so the transition needs to be affordable, it needs to be robust. We don't want to end up in situations where we don't have enough energy. And this transition, in order to reach this transition in an affordable, robust way, I think there's a general agreement here on this panel that in order to do this, we need all energies. We've talked about renewable electricity, we've talked about geothermals, we've talked about heat recovery, cooling recovery, we've talked about biofuels, we've talked about renewable gas. We need all these different energy forms. And so what I want to say is, let's avoid unnecessary debates. Sometimes in France we're specialized in just creating debate. Let's not see different types of energy fighting between each other. Thank you very much.